History never told you this, but some Roman soldiers went to sleep surrounded by corpses after battle. Not because they were fearless, and not because they were cruel, but because the Roman army gave them no other choice. After hours of brutal hand-to-hand fighting, exhausted soldiers often collapsed beside the dead, sometimes without food, sometimes without shelter, and sometimes knowing the same fate could reach them by morning. For a Roman soldier, death was not a rare sight waiting somewhere in the distance. It was part of daily military life. Men marched beside it, fought through it, and often slept beside it. After brutal battles, Roman camps could be surrounded by corpses for days. Sometimes there was no time to bury the dead. Sometimes there was no safe place to move them. And sometimes the soldiers themselves were too exhausted to care. To the modern mind, the idea seems horrifying. But for the Roman army, survival always came before comfort, fear, or dignity. In the Roman world, a soldier who could sleep beside death without breaking down was seen as disciplined, hardened, and useful. The ability to endure horror without hesitation became one of the foundations of Rome's military power. Roman armies spent centuries fighting across deserts, forests, mountains, frozen frontiers, and disease-ridden swamps. Campaigns could last for years. Soldiers marched long distances carrying heavy equipment, built camps at the end of exhausting days, and fought enemies in brutal hand-to-hand combat. After major battles, the ground itself often became a field of bodies. Dead Romans, enemy fighters, horses, and wounded men unable to move covered the landscape. In many situations, soldiers had no realistic option except to remain where they were. The Roman army valued speed and security above nearly everything else. After combat, commanders focused first on reorganizing surviving troops, treating the wounded, guarding against counterattacks, and securing territory. Burial was important in Roman culture, but military necessity came first. If enemy forces still threatened the area, soldiers could be ordered to hold their positions overnight among the dead until the army regained control of the battlefield. Roman warfare was deeply physical. Battles were fought at extremely close range using swords, shields, spears, and knives. Soldiers saw faces, heard screams, and felt bodies collapsing around them. Unlike modern warfare, there was little distance between the killer and the killed. This constant exposure slowly changed how Roman soldiers viewed death. Recruits entering the army for the first time were often terrified by the realities of combat. Ancient writers described inexperienced soldiers trembling before battle, becoming sick from fear, or freezing during combat. But Roman military discipline aimed to destroy hesitation. Training was harsh, repetitive, and relentless. Soldiers learned to obey commands automatically, even under extreme stress. Over time, repeated exposure to violence made many soldiers emotionally numb to sights that would horrify ordinary civilians. Sleeping beside corpses became less a shocking event and more another hardship to endure. Roman camps themselves reveal why this often happened. Every evening, soldiers were expected to construct fortified camps even after exhausting marches. Ditches were dug, walls raised, tents ranged in strict order, and guards posted. The system allowed Roman armies to survive in hostile territory. But after a major battle, camps were not always built far from the fighting. Sometimes the safest place was directly on or beside the battlefield itself. Moving large numbers of bodies required time, manpower, and security that commanders did not always possess. Soldiers might sleep only a short distance from piles of dead, awaiting burial or removal the following morning. In some campaigns, the sheer scale of death made rapid burial impossible. Roman civil wars were especially brutal because Romans fought other Romans. Battles between massive armies could leave tens of thousands dead in a single day. Ancient descriptions of these battlefields speak of rivers clogged with bodies, fields covered with armor and blood, and survivors forced to remain among the dead throughout the night. Exhausted soldiers often collapsed where they stood. Sleep became less about comfort and more about physical survival. A man who had marched, fought for hours, carried equipment, and suffered dehydration could eventually sleep almost anywhere, regardless of the smell or horror surrounding him. Disease was another constant companion of Roman armies. Corpses were dangerous not only psychologically, but physically. Rotting bodies attracted insects, contaminated water, and spread illness. Roman commanders understood some basic connections between filth and sickness, even if they lacked modern medical knowledge. Camps were usually designed with sanitation in mind. Latrines were placed carefully. Drainage systems were built, and burial details were organized whenever possible. But during active campaigns, especially after large battles, perfect sanitation became impossible. Soldiers sometimes endured nights beside decomposing bodies simply because there was no alternative before dawn. Roman soldiers also developed cultural attitudes that made this endurance easier. Roman society admired toughness, self-control, and emotional restraint. Public displays of fear were often viewed as weakness, especially in military life. Courage was not defined as feeling no fear, but as functioning despite fear. Soldiers who endured hunger, wounds, exhaustion, and death without complaint earned respect. Young recruits quickly learned that survival inside the army depended partly on suppressing emotional reactions. Men who panicked easily endangered the entire unit. This culture created soldiers capable of operating in environments that many civilians could barely imagine. Religion also shaped how Romans viewed death. Romans believed proper burial rites mattered deeply, but death itself was an accepted and unavoidable part of existence. Soldiers regularly witnessed executions, gladiatorial combat, public punishments, and war casualties long before joining campaigns. Roman society was, in many ways, far more familiar with visible death than most modern societies. The average Roman soldier did not grow up shielded from violence. By the time he entered military service, he already understood that violent death could arrive suddenly and without warning. On campaign, this awareness became even stronger. Every battle reminded soldiers how easily they themselves could become the next body lying unburied beside the camp. Sleep near the dead also reflected the brutal realities of ancient logistics. Roman armies moved enormous numbers of men across vast territories. Supplying food, weapons, animals, tents, and medical care was already extremely difficult. Transporting or burying thousands of bodies immediately after battle could overwhelm even disciplined forces. In enemy territory, soldiers could not safely spread out searching for burial sites while hostile forces remained nearby. Commanders prioritized maintaining defensive formations through the night. This meant soldiers often stayed close to the battlefield until morning, surrounded by the consequences of the fighting. Weather made conditions even worse. Campaigns continued through rain, heat, mud, snow, and freezing temperatures. Heavy storms could flood battlefields and expose corpses for days. In colder regions, frozen ground made burial difficult. In hotter climates, decomposition happened rapidly, creating unbearable smells that spread across camps. Yet Roman armies continued operating because stopping often meant vulnerability. The army's discipline depended on teaching soldiers to continue functioning regardless of discomfort or horror. Veterans became especially hardened through years of exposure. A new recruit might struggle to sleep after his first battle, but older soldiers had often survived dozens of campaigns. They had seen comrades dismembered, officers killed, camps overrun, and cities destroyed. Ancient military life repeatedly pushed men beyond ordinary psychological limits. Many veterans likely carried emotional scars that ancient writers rarely discussed openly. Roman culture respected endurance, not emotional reflection. Soldiers were expected to keep moving forward. The army rewarded obedience and resilience far more than vulnerability. Some soldiers attempted to cope through superstition, rituals, humor, or fatalism. Others became emotionally detached. Many probably suffered silently. Roman military medicine also contributed to these grim conditions. Battlefield medical care was limited compared to modern standards. Wounded men often remained near the dead until medics or fellow soldiers could reach them. Throughout the night, survivors might hear injured men crying out among corpses scattered across the battlefield. Soldiers sleeping nearby understood that some of those voices would fall silent before morning. The emotional strain of such experiences was enormous, but military necessity allowed little time for recovery. Campaigns continued quickly, often forcing soldiers back into combat days later. Roman commanders understood that fear could spread rapidly through an army. Maintaining discipline after battle was critical, allowing soldiers to abandon positions because of horror or exhaustion, risk disorder, and vulnerability. Strict organization therefore continued even under terrible conditions. Guards still rotated through the night. Orders were still obeyed. Camps still functioned. The Roman army's strength came partly from its ability to impose structure on chaos. Sleeping beside the dead became another example of soldiers enduring conditions that would break less disciplined forces. Ancient historians occasionally described battlefields the morning after combat. Survivors walked among bodies, searching for friends, collecting weapons, or identifying officers. Some wounded men were discovered alive beneath piles of corpses after spending entire nights surrounded by the dead. Animals fed on bodies. The smell of blood and decay lingered for days. Yet these scenes were not unusual exceptions in Roman warfare. They were recurring realities across centuries of conquest and civil conflict. For Roman soldiers, sleeping near death was not considered heroic. It was simply part of military existence. The experience also reinforced loyalty within units. Roman soldiers depended heavily on the men beside them. Shared suffering created strong bonds between comrades who endured the same horrors together. Men who survived brutal nights beside battlefields often trusted each other more deeply afterward. The army relied on this collective endurance. Individual fear mattered less than maintaining the cohesion of the group. Soldiers learned that personal discomfort, grief, or terror could not interfere with the survival of the unit. Over time, many Roman soldiers likely developed a fatalistic mindset. Campaign life constantly reminded them that death could arrive suddenly from arrows, disease, starvation, accidents, or ambushes. This awareness changed how soldiers viewed risk and survival. Sleeping beside dead bodies became another reminder that tomorrow's battle might place them among the corpses instead. Such conditions hardened many soldiers psychologically, though at enormous human cost. The Roman military machine depended not only on weapons and tactics, but on ordinary men conditioned to endure extraordinary suffering. archaeological discoveries continue to reveal the scale of death surrounding Roman warfare. Mass graves found near ancient battlefields show how overwhelming casualties could become. Some graves contain hurried burials, suggesting armies lacked time for proper funerary rituals. Other remains show evidence of severe combat injuries, amputations, and violent deaths at close range. These findings confirm descriptions written by ancient historians. Roman warfare was intimate, exhausting, and relentlessly brutal. Soldiers operated inside environments saturated with death for long periods of time. Yet despite these conditions, Roman armies maintained remarkable effectiveness for centuries. Their success came partly from organization, engineering, and leadership, but also from psychological conditioning. Roman soldiers were trained to continue functioning in circumstances that most people would consider unbearable. Sleeping beside corpses was not a deliberate tradition or ritual. It was the result of practical military realities combined with a culture that demanded endurance above comfort. In many ways, the Roman soldier's relationship with death explains why Rome conquered so much of the ancient world. Roman armies could absorb hardship, violence, and loss without collapsing. Their soldiers marched farther, endured longer campaigns, and recovered from devastating battles with frightening consistency. But behind this military power stood human beings forced to normalize experiences that deeply damaged the mind and body. The image of Roman soldiers sleeping beside dead bodies was not a symbol of cruelty alone. It was evidence of how survival in the ancient world often required people to live closer to death than modern societies can easily understand. By morning, the soldiers would rise, collect their weapons, rebuild formation lines, and continue marching toward the next campaign. The dead remained behind, but the memory of those nights followed many soldiers for the rest of their lives.